Welcome to the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger of bloggingforjobs.com, for an in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, here's your host, Jessica, with this episode of Workology.
Employee relations is an aspect of human resources and business management that often goes unnoticed until a crisis erupts. Maybe it's a situation where employee vacation pay is incorrectly calculated on the most recent employee paychecks, or you're involved in a union voting situation at your company. Welcome to the Workology podcast. It's great to have you on our new podcast as part of the Blogging for Jobs family. Today, we'll be tackling the topic of employee relations, specifically how to effectively balance employee relations itself. My guest is Micheal Vandervort. He's a longtime friend who has a background of more than 25 years of work in HR and employee relations. He's worked with and for some of the most recognizable brands, and most recently is now the executive director of Q, the leading global organization for positive employee relations. Welcome to the podcast, Mike. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks for having me on today. As you said, I've been in HR. Actually, it's good that 25 plus years is getting closer and closer to 30, which always makes me groan inside a little bit. But I guess it means that I have a wealth of experience to draw on in my field, which is employee and labor relations. I was a practitioner for until just the end of 2014. And technically, I still am a practitioner, but I'm doing something a bit different. It's not inside an HR function anymore. As you mentioned, I'm the executive director of an organization called Q, C-U-E, Inc. And we are the probably one of the oldest and foremost organizations for building positive employee workplace relationships in the United States. The organization was founded in the late 70s originally as part of the National Association of Manufacturers as one of their industry groups, and they operated under that umbrella for a number of years, and then were reincorporated and became a standalone not-for-profit agency in 1994. And we have a membership of about 300 companies who joined together to basically share and share knowledge and share information on best practices. And in order to do that, we offer a number of services throughout the year, including webinars and newsletters for our member companies, and also run 2 conferences a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. So it's an entirely different kind of opportunity for me, and it actually brings together a lot of the stuff that I've done through social media and through my speaking work over the last several years while I was still an HR practitioner.
We're going to be talking today about how to balance employee relations. And in Mike's introduction, you heard all the great experience he has, and now some of the things that he's doing over at Q Inc. now that he's the executive director. I kind of want to back things up a little bit for listeners on the podcast. Can you kind of give us your maybe unofficial definition of employee relations? What is it to you?
I think inside the HR field, people often refer to two kind of discrete areas. One is employee relations and the other is labor relations. And many people assume employee relations is for non-union companies and labor relations is for union companies. And that's true to some extent, but really any company that has employees has relationships with those employees, whether they're governed by a union contract or not. And since most employers today are not covered by union contracts, private sector membership in unions is running at 6.6% of the U.S. workforce at the end of 2014. Most companies don't deal with unions anymore, but they do deal with their employees on a daily basis. And employee relations is simply how you manage those relationships with all of the HR and policy practices, procedures, benefits that you put in place, what kind of environment and culture you create, and how you treat your employees.
I think sometimes when we think about the role of human resource professionals, recruiters included under that umbrella, employee relations isn't something that's often talked about. A lot of folks, when I explained to them what I did as an HR director, they just thought I sat behind the desk and was friendly to everyone. And then occasionally had to have some tough conversations with, maybe firing or other maybe investigations type things. But The employee relations topic and the idea of it is extremely important, but it's not just HR's responsibility, in my opinion, but I wanted to get yours. Whose responsibility do you think it is as far as managing this area or process? Is it just HR, or is there more to that?
Yeah, it's definitely not just HR. I mean, to have a truly effective employee relations environment, it's actually every employee in the organization, whether they're in management or not. But probably the baseline relationship is that intersection of the first line supervisor and the people that they interface with who do the work. The how that first line supervisor, no matter where it is in the organization, whether it's on a manufacturing line or on a retail floor, in a store or in a restaurant in the kitchen, how that manager treats the people who report directly to them on a daily basis is really the foundation of everything else that happens in the organization. And of course, HR and benefits. I mean, we have to recruit good people, and we have to have good selection tools, and we have to provide great candidate experiences, and we have to have competitive benefits and wages, and all the other components of the human resources function have to be managed right and done well to have good employee relations. But the key is that supervisor and what kind of training they have and how approachable they are, and just really how they treat people on a daily basis.
I'm starting to see in just the industry in general, and some of the conversations I've been having with practitioners and speaking engagements at the beginning of this year, that because of the economy on the upswing, and companies now more than ever are really kind of reassessing their talent management strategies, particularly on the retention side, that they're wanting to spend more time on training and developing their employees. But I definitely agree with you that one area I think is often overlooked is the frontline managers. They kind of go through their new manager training, if they get that, and then they have their annual training programs that they might or might not be participating in.
The degree of training that companies provide to their first line supervisors varies widely across all of industry. But in my own personal experience, and in looking and in working with some companies that have are known for their employment practices and their great workplaces, I have seen that where they provide an extreme level of training to first line supervisors, where it's done on a regular basis, and there's an expectation that supervisors will complete a regular course of training, which is laid out over a series of years, not, as you said, just an orientation and then throw them out there because they were a good worker and hope for the best. It's structured training designed to help supervisors know how to deal with employment issues. That's an extreme differentiator between a company with great employee relations and those that kind of just have average employee relations. If supervisors don't know how to resolve problems, and they don't know how to manage decisions and deal with them appropriately and consistently, it creates problems that fester, and that can lead to employees who want to unionize or just downfall in terms of productivity, feelings of unfairness, and that's where problems set in. Great employers, like where I worked last at Publix, the supervisors are empowered, they're trained, and they know what to do. And you can clearly see the difference day to day in the performance of the employees and the performance of the business.
I definitely think that the frontline managers can really make a difference. And I saw that firsthand, like you're talking about Publix, but in my retail background also, that the number of call-offs that we had was directly related to certain managers working on weekends. And so a managers just, I guess, how they approach situations and interact with employees can impact the whole location, the store, or the whole company. I could just feel it when we had one manager in particular. There was two of them that worked the same weekend, and I would not have as many call-offs as they would. And so as in HR, because I'd gotten a number of complaints about them, I would walk into the store during the weekend, and you could just feel the difference. I mean, there was just so much tension, and that doesn't make for a great place to work.
Right. And the other thing is too is, over time, I mean, like like many of the employers that you and I have worked for have done annual employee surveys. And if you drill down into, in a lot of the questions on those kind of those 20 standard 25 question surveys deal with how does my manager treat me? I feel respected. Is my manager's interested in my career? Questions like that. And you can see, I mean, if you look at organizations over time where the scores on those types of questions are low, where it's that direct interface between the manager and the worker, if those scores are low, then you'll often see correlation of problems and charges and turnover and all the things that you just mentioned about tense workplace. So it's a critical interface, and companies have to manage it intelligently, or they can suffer a lot of other problems. And even in great companies, if you have a supervisor who kind of goes goes a little bit off the charts, you can see the difference in the performance inside a department in a store. I'm sure you saw that at your employer, where one department might outperform another because the manager was just much more approachable and offered better leadership over time.
Yeah, it was definitely, I think, a good exercise, right? Because in the store locations, you can see how maybe a particular store sales aren't that great, but you have one department that's just kicking booty.
Right.
And it is really because of that manager and how they lead their teams and train their teams, and really the kind of conversations that they have with them.
Right. And I think and there's there's that word that we use all the time, which is engagement. Everybody's always talking about it and trying to define it, and I don't know if there's a definition, but I think that what, for me, engagement is just that, how the managers of a company interface with their employees and how they treat them on a daily basis, and if they're engaged and approachable, you can see that difference, and it's just it's palpable. And that's achieved through, as I said, good HR practices, making sure that policies are fair and consistent, making sure that managers are trained, making sure that the employees have the resources and to do the work that they need to do, and that they're compensated fairly. And it creates an opportunity for people to work in a strong way. If those things are lacking, then it falls down and it leads to other kinds of conflict in the organization. It's to the detriment over time.
You mentioned employee engagement, and I'll just reference this, and we'll put this also in the notes of the podcast. So if you just go over to bloggingforjobs.com and click on the search box in the right-hand side of the website and put in employee relations podcast, you'll be able to get to the resources and references that Mike and myself are mentioning throughout this podcast. We have a previous episode with Susan Fowler, who's an author, and she is a researcher with Ken Blanchard Companies. And so she talked about the science of employee motivation, and then we talked a little bit about engagement. So she has some official definitions and has, for the most part, dedicated most of her professional career to looking at these two areas. It was an interesting conversation. So you guys can reference that. I'll make sure to put the link in this particular post that talks about Mike's interview. I did want to kind of talk a little bit about labor relations.
Sure.
A little bit more. And so we talked about labor relations and employee relations. Can you talk a little bit more maybe about how they overlapped and maybe how they're separate from one another or the same?
Well, generally, employee relations, I think, is the whole set, and labor relations is a subset, because generally the definition for labor relations is that it somehow involves the involvement of a labor union or some other labor organization, a third party who's trying to inject itself into the existing relationship in the workplace between the company and the employees. Sometimes that's done necessarily without employee requests, or sometimes it's done as a result of a small group of employees who may be disgruntled, and other times it becomes a groundswell. And specifically what I'm talking about is things like you see right now, a lot of activity aimed at certain companies in the retail industry. There's an organization that has protested on Black Friday for the last 3 years. I don't want to name specific companies. There's an organization that's conducted nationwide protests, again, aimed at retailers on Black Friday over issues like forcing people to work on Thanksgiving, and wages, and raising the minimum wage, and unfair schedules or inconsistent schedules in retail. And there's also a very large movement right now aimed at the restaurant industry, especially the fast food or QSR sector, that is asking for that the restaurant industry raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour and allow their employees unrestricted rights to join a union. There's currently a strike, a traditional kind of labor relations, strike, which is old school stuff going on with Shell Oil and some other of the refiners down on the Gulf Coast. There's a giant slowdown going on in the ports on the West Coast over a contract negotiation, which is very likely going to turn into an ugly situation and is causing a lot of companies to bypass the ports and fly parts into locations in the Midwest so they can continue production. So I think the big thing is a lot of people in HR, because they don't have a union and they rarely ever see anybody show up with that sign on their back or whatever. They think it doesn't exist, but actually there's a lot of labor activity going on around us for as small as they are. And much of it is driven by what I mentioned earlier, which is that 6.6% level of representation in the private sector. Their unions have fallen down in terms of membership for like 50 consecutive years. They had a slight turnaround over the last couple of years, but it's really put them at a level where they're kind of fighting for survival. So they've invested a lot of time and money into things like electing President Obama and having him appoint favorable members to the National Labor Relations Board, which is a whole other question. The board is very labor friendly right now and is revising a lot of policies. So there's a lot of labor activity going on in the United States. It may not be visible to every employer, but it's there. And it has very definite impact in our economy still. And unions are still very influential in policymaking and in elections and in kind of influencing some of those old school industries. So labor relations is a lot of that kind of stuff. When employees get angry, when they feel that they're not being treated fairly by their employer, we see them to begin to act collectively in these different ways, whether it's asking for to raise the wage to $15 an hour, or literally going on strike at refineries to shut down production to force the employer into a settlement on their contract demands. That's kind of the big difference.
Well, let's take a little bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today's topic is how we can strike a balance in employee relations with my guest, Mike Vandervort. You can connect with Mike on Twitter at Mike Vandervort, MikeVandervort. He's a lot of different places. We'll include the links here on the podcast transcript when we post it on Blogging for Jobs. I want to just say, in hearing you talk and kind of giving us an overview of what's happening in the labor relations sort of space right now, it's clear to me why you are in your role as executive director at Q, because you are really an expert and you absorb and collect all this information about all the activities and things that are happening. Are these the kind of things that members are receiving, like information and news and resources, if they're in a labor relations maybe situation, or they're looking for more employee relations support?
Q as an organization, it's a member services not-for-profit, and we exist to help employers who want to maintain positive employee relations. And so and there's an intersection there that we just talked about, right? There are those companies that don't have unions who do great things and are very successful and just want to continue to do great things or make them even better. And then there are some who, whether through kind of economic reality of, like, say, the automotive industry of a few years ago. I mean, they gave away some of the most lucrative contracts, for years and years and years to the UAW. And then everything fell apart when the housing market melted down, and now there's two-tier wages, and that creates some issues for employers like General Motors and Chrysler, whereas Ford was able to weather it a little better, but they still have contracts. The point being, sometimes you get problems more because of outside forces than because of the interface between your managers and your employees. Either way, Q offers an opportunity for employers who belong to obtain a number of services, including newsletters. webinars on topical labor relations and employee relations items. We do some things around the activities of the NLRB, and we do things on how to influence people in the workplace. I mean, so China Gorman is going to speak at our next conference, so we're going to have China as our Tuesday keynote, and she's going to talk about the Great Place to Work research that they do and what really makes a great place to work. So we're kind of right at that intersection of proactive and reactive, and we try to help our member companies with both sides of that. So we do send out newsletters about the activities of labor unions and what they're doing, what trends we're seeing. We run webinars. Our conferences are a mix of content, and that's really our focus, is to help people who want to manage their business on their own stay ahead of that curve.
What advice do you have for HR or business leaders who are concerned about union activities, maybe within an industry like you're talking about, the restaurant and the retail space, or maybe a particular location that might impact their business?
So one of the things, and so let's focus on the restaurant industry for a second, because I've spent, working in retail and the quick serve restaurants and maybe like the Capitol Grill or some of the higher end restaurants might not be the same pool, but I think you would agree, probably, Jessica, with your own experience, that retail and restaurants kind of hire from the same groups of people. It's the same level of experience. It's people who provide service jobs. So as a person who was working in retail, I was particularly interested in the fight for 15 as it developed, because it in some cities like Chicago, retailers got involved in downtown Chicago along with the restaurant industry, and essentially, since the workforce is very similar, some of the things that we're developing there, it's not a big stretch to imagine that they could fall over into retail at some point. So we watch that closely, and the thing I've observed is that the restaurant industry in general has kept kind of a wary eye on the Fight for 15 efforts, and they've monitored, I presume, through their trade, the National Restaurant Association, and other kind of associations like that. They've monitored the activities, but I think in some discussions I've had with some companies, they are perhaps not as prepared as we were in the retail industry to deal with those groups showing up on their doorstep, and so they were a little behind the curve. So the advice would be, and it's the reason that my organization exists, frankly, is to be proactive in your thought process and your risk management in terms of planning for things like this. Do everything you can on the proactive side to build a culture that's vibrant and offers all those things that we've talked about what makes a great place to work, but also have those reactive plans in place. What if something goes wrong? What if some group of employees gets angry? Because even in great places to work, you'll get from time to time organizations, within the organization, you'll get groups that are not happy and may look outside. And you have to be prepared not only to respond to the employee issues, but to respond if a union should come knocking on your door. And that's the kind of stuff that Q can help with. And that's what many employers kind of leave off the table, because they view it as, why do the work when we've never seen it before? I don't want to spend money on reactive kind of defensive planning. I'd rather invest it in training and proactive stuff, and that can be short-sighted.
I've been the facilitator of many union awareness trainings and also been involved in some union campaigns. But myself, I interfaced with a number of unions at a grocery company that I also worked at, not Publix, but another regional one. And I even had the interesting experience of negotiating a union contract, which I know you're very experienced in.
Mm-hmm.
Is union training for managers enough? Do you think, or what steps can you recommend for education that these frontline managers can be aware and stay informed?
Right. So the very basic thing is you need to provide all your managers with some sort of basic labor relations training, and by that there are things like TIPS and FO. These are acronyms. TIPS is an acronym for the things that a manager can't do or an employer can't do if they start talking to their employees about union activities. TIPS is T is threaten, I is interrogate, P is promise, You can't promise. You can't make promise like drop this union thing and I'll give you a raise, or drop this union thing and we won't make you work on Thanksgiving. You can't make promises, and you also can't surveil your employees and their activities. You're not allowed to retaliate. It's essentially the same kind of protection as employees who file EEOC charges are entitled to. You're not allowed to interfere with their activities. Faux is just simply facts, opinions, and examples. Those are the things that employers are allowed to share with their employees about unions. And so we provide, Q provides that. I mean, when I worked at Publix and many other employers, we provided that as a routine kind of training to our managers. But there's a lot of other stuff you can do. You can have, you can be prepared for the day that a union comes knocking at your door with authorization cards to try to get an election with the NLRB. You can have managers, a special team, sometimes called a jump team, sometimes called a rapid response team. You can have those managers that receive additional extra training prepared ahead of time. You can have websites, you can have content for speeches and all kinds of communication ready to go. Because if that knock comes and you haven't done any of this work, especially in today's environment, the NLRB on April 14th is going to alter the regulations that govern union elections. And what has historically taken 38 to 42 days for an election from the time cards are filed till the time the election is held will probably drop down to somewhere around 14 days. So if a company's not prepared, they're going to have about 2 weeks not only to get all that stuff ready, but to also file any briefs and defenses that they might want to make. And if you're not prepared ahead of time, you're dead under the new regulations. So so companies have to get this stuff up on their radar and begin to work with it right now. It's too late now, really, but better start now if you haven't already.
So you said April. So we'll put a link to the resources related to that. So hopefully you already have a plan in place. But if you don't, let's get started and plan for that, because 14 days is not a lot of time when you're in the throes of that.
Yeah, I mean, think about it as in terms of a presidential election. If a candidate is running, if they only had 1 month to win the hearts and minds of voters in America, then whoever was the favorite at the beginning is probably going to be the favorite at the end. Because the campaign lasts 2 years, a lot of things can happen, mistakes can be made, new ideas can be introduced and considered. So the length of the election period is a critical kind of time period and the shorter it is, if a union is on the rise, it's a lot harder to ward it off with just 10 or 14 days.
Well, I want to thank you for joining the Workology podcast today, hosted by me, Jessica Miller-Merrill. Mike, where can people go to learn more about you or to connect with you after this podcast goes live?
If you Google Micheal Vandervort, you'll find me. But Jessica already gave my Twitter, Mike Vandervort. You can also check out my organization at QInc.com. That's CUEINC.com. And we have a Twitter account to share labor relations stories, which is CUEINCSA, QIncSA. So those are a few places, and if you go to any of those, you'll find the rest.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate all your information on how to help balance employee relations.
Thank you. It was great.
Until next time, folks, thank you for joining us here on the Workology podcast. You can visit Blogging for Jobs to listen to all our past episodes. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill